So welcome everybody. My name is Richard Anderson. I'll be chairing the talk today by Mike Davidson, who's going to be speaking on A Failed Sojourn in the Sun, a comparative study of the journals of Jonathan Troup of Dominica in Aberdeen, 1786 to 1798. Mike is a retired consultant in oral and maxillofacial surgery. He has a long-standing interest in the history of medicine and was awarded the Osler Prize Lectureship at the Society of Apothecaries in 2016. In 2020, he was awarded a MLit in Scottish Heritage by Aberdeen University. The degree dissertation was entitled A Scottish Doctor's Observations and Experiences of the British West Indies, a comparative analysis of the pre-emancipation journals of Jonathan Troup, 1764 to 1800. Mike kindly previously shared this dissertation with me. I knew about it through a colleague who said that there's been an excellent dissertation in recent years written on the journals of Jonathan Troup. And so Mike will tell us about that today. We'll have about 30 minutes for the talk, and then about 25 minutes for questions. You can put those in the chat along the way, or we can take them at the end. Mike.
Thank you, Richard, for that kind and slightly flattering introduction. I'll try and live up to it. And thanks to the group for the opportunity for me to present my work and learn from any feedback you've got. I'm going to switch off my camera in a minute because I always hate seeing myself in the mirror while I'm talking. So I hope you'll tolerate that. I'll share my screen. Here we go. At least I'll try and share it. Is it sharing all right? Are we sharing?
No, not yet.
What the hell's going on here?
Might it be that Mike is a guest? Can we change it to make him a host or presenter? Is that perhaps the issue?
It says that everyone can share. So I've got
okay.
everyone available to share.
For some reason, it is not functioning.
Is it not letting you, or is it?
Hold on. Oh, God.
If it helps, Mike, I can share mine. I can open it up and share them.
It's not coming up as an option. It just. Let me just. I don't quite know why it's not allowing me to share it. I don't usually use Teams very often. Is it sharing now?
It's working now, yeah.
There it is, yeah.
Okay, lovely. I'll have another go. As I speak, I must firstly apologise for any language or concepts in relation to enslavement that were used by our ancestors, but rightly are unacceptable to modern audiences and susceptibilities. The material I'm presenting, as we've said, arises from my MLit dissertation, and the work centred around comparing Troup's journals with the writings of other colonists, both permanent and transient, in the British West Indies during the era of enslavement and the related plantation economy. As I continued my research, it became apparent that this was predominantly a story of a failed sojourn, compared in sharp contrast with the rather recurrent narrative of returning wealthy, successful Scots. So what are the key events in Troup's life? Well, he was born in Aberdeen in 1764 and graduated from Marshall College in Aberdeen with an MA, which was typical for most medics in that era, in 1786. He then underwent studies in medicine, both in Glasgow and Aberdeen, and visited London, between 1786 and 1789. In 1790, he was recruited by Dr. Clark, an Aberdeen graduate, on the recommendation of Dr. Morrison of Aberdeen. Clark worked with a colleague, Finland, also an Aberdeen graduate, in Dominica in the West Indies. Things did not go well, and in 1791, Troup returned to Scotland and entered rural practice in Aberdeenshire, and eventually dies in Scotland in 1800 in Tarland, Aberdeenshire. So Jonathan Troup's journals are held in the University of Aberdeen Special Collections, and they're in the form of 3 manuscripts which describe his life and clinical practice both in Dominica and Aberdeenshire, and the related sea journeys between the two. Firstly, there's Troup's Dominican journal, and it covers roughly between 1788 and 1790, and it's a volume of 176 pages and includes over 70 line and watercolor drawings, both of indigenous flora, fauna, and scenes from free mulatto and enslaved African communities. As we hear, this is what he describes as a mulatto woman, almost certainly a freed and enslaved. Essentially, the Troup journal from Dominica is the most investigated of all the journals. Specific subtopics for study are medical practice, observations of the enslaved, free Black and European societies, as well as natural history. And the journal represents the views of a relatively inexperienced clinician new to the Caribbean. It has been used by Douglas Hamilton and Richard Sheridan in their books Scotland in the Caribbean and the Atlantic World, and Sheridan's work Doctors and Slaves. Rachel Peacock, in her MA thesis, explored the qualities and attributes needed for professional success and social advancement, commenting on Troup's failure. And Claire Swan, in a paper, A Life of Debauchery, Vice and Drunkenness, used it as an example of the excesses of Scots in the West Indian society during the era of enslavement. Next slide, please. Thank you. You can obtain online access to the Dominican journal in the form of a synopsis, as we see here, as well as handwritten notes you can download as a PDF. Next slide, please. The other 2 journals are, one is a journal from 1791 to 1797, and it records Troup's return journey from Dominica to Aberdeenshire and his efforts to establish himself as a medical practitioner. There's additional notes, medical notes and remedies, and the volume contains details of his early financial difficulties, his ambition, and his social life. And that is shown here. The other is called The Cash Book of Jonathan Troup, and despite its title, there's very little in there of medical accounts. The book mainly reflects the wide-ranging reading of a man of the Enlightenment, and Troup has an eclectic collection of entries, including aphorisms of Hippocrates and observations on money, philosophy, religion, society, history, geography, and literature. In the journal, there are also considerable extracts from medical transcripts, particularly the lectures of William Cullen of Glasgow. Next slide, please. Here we have Dominica. It's part of the Windward Islands change in the Lesser Antilles in the West Indies. And Troup was one of Dr. Clark's and Finland's assistants, and he's based in the capital, Rousseau, which is down here. And the practice covered 2/3 of the 16,000 population. The rest of the population were covered by approximately 11 other doctors. So what were the possible reasons for Troup's moving to Dominica? Jonathan Troup was the product of a Scottish educational system which offered middle-class boys a thorough and broad-based training, but then released them onto a market that just was an underdeveloped economy where very few could reach their academic potential or fulfill their ambitions. The resultant competition was a push, which, allied to the pull of external opportunities for financial advancement and adventure, drove Scottish migration. Richard Perez has commented that Scotland was a country poor in natural resources, but possessed of an educational system several sizes too large for it. The Caribbean provided opportunities for those able to survive the climate and endemic diseases. Douglas Hamilton estimates that around 17,000 Scots emigrated to the West Indies during the period 1750 to 1800. Alan Kerres, in an article reviewing the letters of Alexander Johnson, an Aberdonian doctor who practiced in Jamaica, highlights the migration of Johnson's friends in Aberdeen. Johnson wrote, "Of the 8 men of his Society of Gentlemen, all men of the greatest abilities and most excellent natural talents, 6 went to the West Indies. We don't know what happened to them." James Clark owned Clark Hall Estate, a Dominican sugar plantation, which at its peak was home to over 250 enslaved individuals. In his journal, Jonathan Troup comments, "Saw Dr. Clark's Negro with a chain and collar of iron round his neck. Though he is strong, the weight made him bleed at nose and mouth. Dr. Clark has about 50 Negroes employed. He makes great profit from them." Next slide, please. Thank you. Many migrants to the West Indies failed to prosper or died before making sufficient capital to enable a successful return home. Their voice is largely unheard in the historical records. Troup did have some insight into the difficulties of a profitable sojourn. Early in his stay in Dominica, he wrote, "One man only makes a fortune in the West Indies out of 500. On his return to Scotland, Troup attempted to set up practice in Aberdeen, but failed, and set up a single-handed practice in the parish of Tarland, as shown here. It's about 30 miles to the west of Aberdeen. As shown in the statistical records of 1793 for the parish, it was a low-income agricultural community. The account records families being driven to local towns and Aberdeen due to rural poverty. So it's hardly a promising environment for success without serious application and patience, an avenue, to be honest, Troup was not suited to go down. Next slide, please. Here we see Troup's fees in Dominica set by the practice, and it reveals the medications and treatments that he used. The transcript is from Doctors and Slaves by Richard Sheridan. Troup's clinical practice, like that of his contemporaries, was rooted in Galenic humoral principles, including the empirical use of herbs and minerals. Medical intervention corrected the imbalance of the body's 4 humors. Medicine or procedures included purging, vomiting, bloodletting, blistering, and sweating, all aimed to release excess humors. Troup's professional fees reflect the common treatments of the time and are compatible with published works of his contemporaries. Despite Troup's criticism of his colleagues, both in the West Indies and Tarland, for practicing empirically and not being informed as he was by profound study of nature and the literature, I can find no real difference in Troup's clinical methods with the common practice of his contemporaries. Next slide, please. Have you got the next one? Yeah, super. Thank you. These graphs reflect the patterns of diseases as percentage encountered by Troup in both Dominica and Aberdeen from my estimates from reading his journals. The categories are approximate and generalized as he describes major symptoms rather than coming to refined diagnoses. And we can see that parasites are high in Dominica and respiratory issues are high in Aberdeenshire. Many conditions that presented in Dominica to recently arrived doctors were familiar and managed as those would be in Britain. For example, trauma, obstetrics, smallpox and venereal disease. Other diseases were specific to the West Indies, such as yellow fever, parasites, yaws, and the practice of dirt eating. These provided a challenge for newly arrived practitioners. Troup had a little only of 2 years medical experience in Britain following his graduation in humanities from Aberdeen before moving to Dominica. In his journals, he indicates he extensively reads contemporary medical textbooks, but there is no evidence that he consulted texts produced by doctors experienced in managing tropical disease. His antagonism to colleagues who had experience of clinical conditions in Dominica reduced his learning opportunities. Some newcomers, unlike Troup, recognized the need to develop practice for the West Indies. Dr. B. Mosley, a published and experienced physician, was critical of practitioners whose limited Caribbean experience suggested new treatment methods, and comments only long residence, great practice and observation would enable practical clinical developments. William Bremner recorded early in his time in Dominica, "I therefore set myself out to learn and put into practice the particular rules of treating West Indian diseases in both blacks and whites." New slide, please. So I submit these are the reasons for the failure of Dr. Troup in Dominica. He was intellectually arrogant, didn't get on with his colleagues, he disregarded clients at times, he just could not manage his income and was often in chronic debt. His attitude to professional entitlement, he was distracted by non-medical interests, all of which led to an irreversible failure of the support networks that were so important in a successful career in the colonies. And in my view, these character traits resulted in this breakdown that other people managed to exploit. And there's evidence of these problems from the Aberdeen Journal, and they underline that Troup's difficulties in promoting his career, both at home and abroad, were largely self-inflicted. Next slide, please. So to take intellectual arrogance, within 5 months of arriving in Dominica, Troup's relationship with his employer, Dr. Finland, began to fail. He lost respect for Finland, both as a man of learning as well as a clinician. And for example, there was a difference between Finland and Troup in an enslaved boy who was described as having suspected hydrophobia. Finland and Troup disagreed over his treatment, and Troup describes Finland in his journal as an ignorant blockhead, and then later refers to him as the relationship deteriorates. "Let Dr. F know I am not to be mocked and shuffled off." As he wrote in his journal following another difference with Finland, he quotes Horace, "Nullis addictus jure in verbre magistri," or "I am not bound over to swear allegiance to any master." Troup did not visit the plantations as often as Finland wished. Troup stated, "Dr. Finland complained of me to Mr. Rainey for my indolence." Dr. Thomas of Nevis, in giving evidence to the Privy Council Committee in 1789, reported that surgeons were expected to attend slave hospitals once or twice a week, or more often if needed. Dr. Granger in 1764, in writing a book on diseases and treatment of slaves in the Caribbean, comments, "No medical practitioner can do justice to an estate who does not visit the sick twice a week, either himself or his assistant, or oftener if needed." Troup just was not meeting these targets. In Dr. Finland's view, failure to visit the plantations threatened the practice's reputation. He could not afford to lose clients for financial or social reasons. His planter clients were an integral part of a network of social and financial support for his medical practice, as well as his own business opportunities. Troup also antagonized plantation owners. For example, Mr. Cobham, Troup wrote, "He quarreled with me for inattention. I told him I was surprised, if that I was not the best judge of these matters." He comments that Troup adopts a grovelling manner to plantations to find business. And when he's in Tarland in Aberdeenshire, he complains that the constant need to chase business and travel for the convenience of the patients. Essentially, this is a man who fails to realize that availability and affability are as important as ability in building a clinical practice. Next slide, please. Troup just fails to manage his money. The Caribbean did offer Troup, if he could establish a clinical practice, a method of securing income. So money is the likeliest reason for his emigration. This is reinforced by frequent journal entries, both in Scotland and in the West Indies, on the need to gain a sufficient income so he could enjoy a comfortable, appropriate lifestyle. His Aberdeen journal and Dominica also chart his inability to manage money, a recurring debt, and requests of loans both from colleagues, friends, and family. He borrowed from a prominent Scottish planter and politician in Dominica, James Lane, and comments, "Lane promises to pay for me until I get money of my own." His inability to manage money resulted in him still owing Dr. Clark £70 when he left Dominica. And here we see the promissory note from the journal for £70 to Dr. Clark. When he left Dr. Finland and Clark's employment, he sought permanent work in St. Rupert's Bay in Dominica. He refused several positions as he could not agree terms. Troup had an elevated opinion of his value. His fees and conditions were significantly in excess of prevalent rates in Dominica and lately Aberdeenshire. A planter advised him first to gain the trust of his future employers before raising a salary, but his constant answer was, "I will not kill myself for nothing," while setting his annual rate at no less than 20 shillings per slave. Dr. Alexander Johnson and Colin McCartney described annual capitation fees for medical care of slaves at that time in Jamaica at 5 shillings per annum. This tendency to overrate his market worth was repeated in Scotland. Many of his patients thought his fees were too high and complained or wouldn't attend him. He dismissed this view as being put about by his competitors and not a genuine patient concern. Journal entries in Dominica and Aberdeenshire emphasize his feeling that the prevalent fee structure was inadequate. In Aberdeenshire, he complains about often being paid in kind and a lack of interest in his idea of a subscription fee structure. When his career was not progressing in Scotland, Troup considered returning to the West Indies and wrote to Dr. Clark and Dr. Lovelock in Dominica seeking support, including monetary advances. This was not forthcoming. In his journal, he recorded a need to pawn his watch as well as borrowing money whilst in Scotland. In Scotland, an unsettled financial and professional situation resulted in considering moving to London, the East Indies, or returning to West Indies. He writes in his Aberdeen journal, "If I remain in Cromer, I must submit to beggary and drudgery." He considered anywhere other than Scotland offered him better opportunities to gain position and income. Next slide, please. During his time in Dominica, Troup spent a lot of time on the study of natural history. The time he spent studying the natural world was perceived as a distraction from his clinical work and made him appear lazy. Regular natural history entries and drawings only appear in his Dominican journal. This perhaps reflects his desire to use Dominica to establish himself as a scientist, or perhaps it just reflects the excitement of the novel and exotic. In his Aberdeen journal, he does not comment on any active interest in natural history, suggesting self-promotion was in driver, at least in part, in Dominica. Referencing his Dominican natural history activity, he comments in the journal in Dominica that he writes to men of science who would grow his reputation. In his letters to Sir Joseph Banks of the Royal Society and Dr. Munro of Edinburgh University, he seeks to forge links with prominent scientists of the day. In Aberdeen, when he returned, he attempts a similar policy by contacting prominent men at the university and the Aberdeen Medical Society. There's no evidence that any of these attempted contacts bore significant fruit. Next slide, please. Dr. Finlan believed he spent too much time exploring Dominica's non-white societies at the expense of medical practice. Here we see drawings and comments on dance, dress, and working conditions. Notice the overseer with a whip, of the enslaved population. This interest doesn't seem to arise from abolitionist tendencies, but rather curiosity. Troup defended himself to criticism from his employer, Dr. Finlan. I told him that I would still, in my leisure time, pursue natural history. And there are many such hours in a man's life. Finlan obviously did not agree. And again, this gave the appearance that Troup just was not focusing on clinical work or the needs of the practice. Next slide, please. Dr. Clark was absent for most of the early months of Troup's appointment. However, on his return, matters did not improve. Troup records, Dr. Clark called on me. He called me ungrateful for my conduct since I had come to this island. I told him I would clear up everything before Dr. Finlay and Mr. Rainey. But the dispute continued, and Dr. Clark told Troup, I wish I had not brought you out. I'll write to your friends what a man you are. In alienating his influential sponsor, Dr. Clark, Troup had damaged the patronage network yet again. Clark's threat to inform friends emphasizes the network system could work against the newcomers' interest as well as their benefit and could stretch back to Scotland. While in Scotland, Troup spoke to Sheriff Turner, who advised him he should seek the patronage of Dr. George Skene, Professor of Medicine and Regent of Marischal College. There is no evidence that Skene assisted Troup in a search for a lucrative position. However, he did act as a character reference in a dispute about clinical care in Thailand. Here we have, and I'm sorry if it's a bit small, but it's a letter that Troup wrote from Scotland to Dr. Clark's Scottish lawyer to be forwarded to Dominica, seeking a return to the Dominican practice. He prepared at least 4 drafts of this letter and dragged sending it over some considerable time, as he couldn't make up his mind to leave Scotland, but he did finally submit it. And his lack of insight into the magnitude of his Dominican errors is brought home by Clark's reply. Regarding this request, Troup wrote, got a letter from Dr. Clark telling me to subdue my fickle mind. I shall not return to the West Indies. The writings of other West Indian colonists emphasize the importance of professional and kin networks, not only in obtaining positions, but in subsequent advancement. Troup's failure is in sharp contrast to years of application and exploiting of professional and social networks by successful Scottish doctors in the West Indian colonies. Final slide, please. Thanks for your attention, everybody. Apologies for the technological glitches my end. I'm happy to take any questions either now or by email. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. It's technical glitches shared.